built the Hunley? How was the submarine built? How many Hunleys were made? How did the sub work? And was there actually a Connecticut Union private on the Hunley's historic crew? After 15 years of conservation and study of the crew remains and sub, do we finally know what really happened to the Hunley on that fateful night? Mr. Vitello is a member of the Civil War Roundtable of South Central Connecticut, a charter member of the Friends of the Hunley, a lifelong member of the Titanic Historical Society, and a charter member of TIGHAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery.
We don't have the video on, so if you wanted,
George, look at this flag.
Oh, is the picture okay?
you see
Oh.
it where it says view,
Okay.
you hit that.
Hmm.
Show view. Okay.
No,
No.
You don't see that?
Okay, I don't see it. My thing is coming in, it seems to be coming in very good. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, if you can't see me, that's okay, as long as you can hear me. Anyway, lifelong resident of New Haven, Phil is a graduate of the University of New Haven, majoring in law enforcement administration. Now, during the presentation, don't forget to mute your microphones. At the end of the talk, there, of course, will be a period of questions and answers. You can make your questions in here by either through chat or just raise your hand the old-fashioned way. Afterwards, the meeting will be posted on YouTube for anybody who's not able to attend tonight's meeting. And enjoy the presentation. And it's all, take it away, Phil.
where is
Okay,
it?
well, Stuart, thank you so much for a really nice introduction. Appreciate that. And I want to thank the Civil War Buffs group. I've never spoken here before, and it's gonna be should be a fun night. Need to thank Mark too, because I think Mark was heard me on one of his other groups and got me hooked up here. So I need to thank Mark for that. And it should be a fun night. It's a strange year for all of us. I know with doing the Zoom talks, and even in our own group, we've had to do the Zoom talks to keep things going. And I'm sure that's probably what you guys are doing. But to our surprise, the Zooms, I don't know how you guys find it, the Zooms have worked out pretty well. I mean, it's kept things going and keep people interested. So it's a good tool that we have. And we're fortunate that we can all do that. And it kind of makes it interesting when we can, you know, you can get, the benefit is you can get speakers from anywhere, you know, which kind of makes it kind of cool. But anyways, so will I be able to share my screen now? I'll put it up.
Yes.
I should be able to share? Okay, let's see.
Whose picture is that?
That's Mark's.
I can't share yet.
Yeah, hold on a second.
This is our new
Right now.
Okay, see,
secretary, and
all
he's
right.
at the firehouse on Albany Shaker Road. He's seems to be very technical.
There it is.
How's that?
I can see it.
That's
What's going on?
Phil, we can't hear you. You've got your microphone muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now, guys?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess when I shared the screen, somehow it did mute me, but okay, as long as you can hear me. So
sounds good.
again, what's really cool about this story, I always love talking about this story many times that I have, and it's a great story. It really is. And not only is it a great story in the Civil War history,
No.
it's a great story in American history. It really is. And if you think about it, or as we will see, this story has kind of everything. It has innovation, ingenuity, courage, dedication, death, romance, adventure, mystery, legend. I mean, all of those will fit into this story for sure. Don't know why I'm seeing this bar across the top here. Okay, well, I can still see it. All right. So what we're looking at is, and actually let me preface by this. I am talking to Civil War buffs, so I don't need to say that, gee, it's a surprise that there were submarines in the Civil War. Everybody here knows that. But we are going to talk about one very special submarine, and that will be the submarine that's going to make history. Now, let me back up 1 second. There we go. So this painting you see, Conrad Wise Chapman, who was a famous sketch artist back during the Civil War era, somewhere probably on, because I'm the host, guys, I'm seeing to admit people here. Okay, all right. Conrad Wise Chapman had sketched the Hundley probably at Mount Pleasant, where she was docked at the time. And after the war, he would create this famous painting that you now see somewhere around 1866. Now, until they found the Hundley, nobody knew what the Hundley looked like. This was the only image they had. And many historians through the years thought it was not accurate and it could not possibly be the Hundley. It kind of looked more modern than it did Civil War-ish, if you can say. And when they found the Hundley, they realized that this sketch and painting was very accurate. Conrad Wise Chapman got a lot of good detail in here, and he got it right. So what I want to do tonight, I want to tell the whole story. I know some people have probably talked about the recovery. Some maybe have talked about what the Hundley did. I want to tell the whole story about the Hundley. We're going to talk about planning and construction, the Hundley in action, discovery and recovery, and the crew burial. The Civil War was the breeding ground for modern warfare, known for many of its firsts, based by many historian experts. First war with ironclad navies, probably recognize that scene, Monitor and the CSS Virginia. First war, machine guns. Electrically exploded bombs and torpedoes. This was a design from E.C. Singer, Edgar Collins Singer. You probably may not be familiar with Edgar Collins Singer, but I think everybody here knows his uncle, Isaac Merritt Singer, founder of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. This next Civil War first is actually my favorite Civil War first, and that would be the first war with an aircraft carrier, the aircraft carrier George Washington. I kind of like that one. And of course, the very first war with the submarine that would successfully attack and sink an enemy ship in war, and that would be the Hundley. And it was so far advanced ahead of its time, it wouldn't be until September 5th, 1914, in World War I, when the German submarine U-21 is going to slam a torpedo in the side of the British cruiser, the Pathfinder, killing all but 9 of a crew of 268. But advances in development underwater devices date far back. Men like Alexander the Great, 332 BC, Leonardo da Vinci, 15th century. We have David Bushnell, local boy out of Osabra, Connecticut, graduate of Yale University. He's credited with the first submarine ever used in combat as he tried to sink British warships. We have another American inventor, Robert Fulton, known for the steamboat Clermont. He's contracted by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798 to build submarines to sink, what else? British warships. It was hand cranked with a crew of 3. And here's a sketch of that submarine. And he called that submarine, ironically, the Nautilus. Now, if you look in that blue circle flashing, you would see there's a sail on that submarine. So when the submarine was not submerged to help propel it along, there would be a sail. Now, it wasn't successful, and Napoleon would eventually cancel that contract. But Robert Fulton did make the attempt. But our story begins here. And it begins in New Orleans. And it was the largest city in the South in the fall of 1861. And in New Orleans, we're going to find a machine shop run and owned by James McClintock and Baxter Watson. They were maritime engineers manufacturing steam engines at a small machine shop, and that was on Front Street in New Orleans. And they were also contracted to make bullets for the Confederacy. During this time, they were tinkering with the idea of building a submarine. Also at this time, another person is going to come into our story, and that is going to be Horace Lawson Hunley himself. Horace Lawson Hunley was born in Sumner County, Tennessee in 1823. He would be a graduate of Tulane University in 1849. He would spend most of his adult years in New Orleans and become a state legislator, a lawyer, and would make a fortune for himself with sugarcane crops. So he's going to team up with McClintock and Watson. And he's very interested in this project. He is not an engineer by any stretch of imagination, but he can provide the financing for McClintock and Watson to build submarines. So McClintock and Watson are going to build them, and Hunley is going to provide the financing. And that is how they're going to team up. So why does South need submarines? Well, I think Stuart mentioned earlier in the meeting that the blockade had a huge effect, not early on, but go back. The problem is being the host, I got this bar going across my screen, guys. I don't know if you see it or not, but it does block my view. Okay, sorry. So Winfield Scott, who was Abraham Lincoln's, he was his military advisor early in the war. And Winfield Scott was a famous man in his own right, general in the War of 1812, hero in the War of with Mexico in 1848. And he's going to advise how you he's going to advise how to win the war. Need to blockade the South. And this is why you see the snake here, and they would call this Scott's Anaconda Plan. And he said, you know what, you got to blockade the ports, take control of the Mississippi, cut the South in half, and strangle them into submission. Now, most experts thought this was ridiculous. The war was going to last only a couple of months, and this would totally not be necessary. But in the end, old Winfield Scott was right, because this is pretty much what happened along the way. And the blockade had a huge effect on turning the tide of the war. So Horace Hunley, James McClintock, Baxter Watson, and also E.C. Singer and Gus Whitney, between them, they would finance to build 3 submarines. The first one is called the Pioneer. The second one is called the Pioneer II, or the American Diver. And the third one would get the name of H.L. Hunley. It would be the Hunley. So, and it would stand to reason over you building anything new for the first time, there might be some prototypes and you might build some other versions of it as along the way. And that was the case here. So the first one, the Pioneer. Hunley's going to finance that, spend over $10,000 to build the Pioneer. And they would be so impressed with the early results of it that they would submit a letter of marque and it would be approved by the Confederate government so they could attack enemy shipping. Now, these men were patriotic for the Southern cause, for sure, but they had another motive. There was a lot of money to be made for privateering and sinking Union warships. There was a lot of money to be made. So financially, gains for them for sure. So this submarine is made of a 1/4-inch steel iron plates bolted to the frame. The bolt heads were countersunk to provide a smooth surface. And it was about 34 feet long with a crew of 3 and hand cranked for propulsion. Now, as we talk about the submarines and the Hunley, propulsion is going to be a big issue with these submarines because they didn't have the electric motors and the diesel engines of today. So that's always going to be a problem with these submarines. And you can see by the design of the Pioneer, if you see, she's a little bit roundish there, and they had a problem with her rolling a lot. But her first test was actually pretty good in Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans. She would sink a small schooner and several crafts, and actually first test trials were successful. But the war is going to get in the way. Union Army, late 1862, is going to capture New Orleans. New Orleans is going to fall. And so Watson, McClintock, and Hunley are going to have to scuttle that sub. And they're going to escape the city. They're barely going to be able to escape the city. That sub would get scuttled. A little side note, years later, it would be found by the Union Army. They would make sketches of it, and it would be broken up and sold for scrap. So that sub does not exist. So now we have our 3 guys. They're on the run. They want to continue their attempt to build a submarine, but they need a place to do that. And I'm going to leave them for a moment. And while they're looking for that new location of where they can continue their experiments, we're going to bring in another part of our story. But first, McClintock would say, the only good thing that could be said about the Pioneer was no one was killed working it. And we are going to bring in a couple of more characters into our story. And that's going to be Lieutenant George Dixon and his sweetheart, Queenie Bennett. Now, some of you might say, well, what does this have to do with this story at all? Well, Lieutenant Dixon there on the left, in the end, he will eventually become captain of the Hunley on the night that she's going to make history. And there is the mystery of the story I'm going to bring in of the Lucky Charm gold coin. This is going to bring us to the Battle of Shiloh, April 6th, 7th, 1862. I don't need to explain to these Civil War buffs the bits of the Battle of Shiloh. You already know that, but let's bring this part in. So Lieutenant Dixon, 22-year-old Lieutenant Dixon, he's fighting with the 21st Alabama, and he's going to be shot in the thigh in this battle, and he's going to be wounded, and will be sent back to Alabama for recovery. The part of the story that gets really interesting here is Queenie Bennett. Now, the way the story is given and passed down through the years, Queenie Bennett had given his sweetheart a $20 gold coin as a good luck charm to take with him in battle. It was this coin that would help blocked the bullet that would save Dixon's life. So supposedly this good luck coin that was given to Dixon was in his pocket. He was hit in the thigh and it would deflect the bullet and that would save his life. Now, no one at this time really knew if, years later if that was true. A lot of mysteries and stories are passed down through the years. A lot of them gets made up, stories get changed around, and nobody knew if this story was true, but it was passed down through the Bennett family. And so I only ask you to remember Queenie Bennett and the gold coin. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later on into our story. So we're going to find that our inventors and Horace Hundley, they're going to find a new spot to build their next submarine. That's going to be Mobile, Alabama. Mobile, Alabama had ample machine shops at this time and had very calm waters of Mobile Bay. That made this really a great location to build their next torpedo boat. James Buchanan, ironically, who was the first captain of the ironclad CSS Virginia, he was current overall commander of the Mobile district at that time. So they're going to find their location at the Park and Lines Machine Shop in Mobile, and it's located in the corner of Water and State Street. And this is where they're going to build their second sub, the Pioneer 2. And eventually the Hundley will also be built in this building. So McClintock and Watson, Hundley, they're going to arrive there May of 1862. Hundley financing this second project completely with its own funds, costing in the range of around $15,000. But also, you had the 21st Alabama that was back from the Battle of Shiloh that were back here. And this is where a couple of other players come into the story. And at this machine shop, the 25-year-old engineer, Lieutenant William Alexander, he's on the right. That's an older picture of him, of course. And Lieutenant Dixon, who we mentioned earlier, both of the 21st Alabama, and they become deeply involved in the projects. William Alexander was an amazing engineer. And he doesn't, I don't think, get the credit that he deserves on these projects. Lieutenant Alexander, William Alexander, he's really going to be the one that's going to actually have the sub built based on the designs and drawings from James McClintock. Eventually, they're going to outgrow that building and they're going to move it into a new location to finish it up, and that's going to be the Seamen's Bethel Church. So let's get a look at the Pioneer 2. And you can see the design here. It is built larger than its predecessor, and that was, they wanted to try and get a working electrical engine in there, but they can never really get that done. So in the end, it would have a crew of 5. McClintock would say this in a letter: "We built a second boat at Mobile to obtain room for machinery and persons. She was made 36 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet high. 12 feet on each end, was built tapered or molded to make it easy to pass through the water." You know, and after several tests while moving further out into Mobile Bay for position on enemy ships, the submarine is going to sink in rough water in February of 1863. Fortunately, there's no record of any loss of life at this time. But now they have a problem here because they've now lost 2 subs. They're almost out of money. And basically, they're back to the drawing board, to square one. They have nothing to show for all their efforts. But they are going to attempt to try it one more time. They're going to scrape together enough money and resources to try again. The Confederacy said, we'll give you all the help you need, but what we can't give you is money. So they're on their own on that. Anyways, that third and final sub, well, that's going to end up being the Hunley. And it's going to be completed in July of 1863. And McClintock's going to design, he's really going to go all out to make a great improvements on this submarine. And let's go over some of the points here of what this submarine now has. Its overall length is 42 feet, 5 inches, width of 4.5 feet, and it has a cruise speed of only 1 to 2 knots, and it could sprint out at short speeds of maybe 3 to 4 knots. Remember, I said propulsion is going to be a really big issue with the submarine. There were 18 glass ports that could be blacked out from the inside for a total of stealth capabilities. So in the forward conning tower, there were 5 glass ports, 2 in the rear, and then you had a row of 5 of 2 there. So it gave you 18 ports. And the center ones here, they could be blacked out. So for total stealth, they had little shutters from the inside, they can shut them down. They had 2 hatches in cut water to cut down on friction. 2 diving planes and a rudder controlled by the captain with the joystick lever, years ahead of its time using the joystick. It had 8 keel weights totaling 4,000 pounds, and this would account for giving it ballast and also emergency release. The total operating weight of this submarine was just about 15,000 pounds. So those center keel weights, they could be dropped in an emergency to release the sub so she can rise up, as you see there. Now let's look at the inside of the sub a little bit. She had forward and aft ballast tanks with pumps so they can expel water or have the water come into the sub so they can be lowered. Now, the interesting thing what McClintock did, he would run piping on the floor of the sub between the 2 ballast tanks so they could balance off the sub by pumping water and back and forth between the 2 tanks. Also, if one of the pumps failed in either the front or the rear, the other one could take over to pump out water. Had an 8-man crew. You had 7 on the cranks and 1 navigator. In the captain's position, you can see there in the flashing circle. And he had a mercury depth gauge to give him the depth and a compass. Compass never really worked well, not in an iron sub. Second position behind the captain also worked a bellows type snorkel for intaking fresh air. There's no record of it that it worked really very well at all, but they did have it, and I don't think it was really used all that much. So how's it going to sink? How is it going to sink enemy ships? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to have a 150-foot long rope dragged by the Hunley, and on the end of that rope will be a Singer torpedo, contact torpedo. And the plan is you would, when you got close to the enemy ship, you would dive down, take the sub under the ship, dragging the torpedo, and then the contact would hit the ship and blow it up. That's in theory what they wanted to do, something like this. And down she goes. And so that's the plan of how they're going to attack and sink enemy ships. So by July of 1863, just 5 months after the second submarine, the Pioneer, sank, the new sub is in Mobile Bay, and under the watchful eye of Confederate military, she successfully dives, attacks, and sinks a barge. And safely returns to the surface. She's a great success. And now the Hunley's ready to go. And now the issue is, well, who wants the Hunley? At this time, Mobile Bay really wasn't being affected by the blockade all that much. So who wanted the Hunley? Well, it was someone who really did want this Hunley for help with the blockade. Admiral Buchanan, he writes to P.G.T. Beauregard in command of the Confederate forces of Charleston. And he's going to tell him, I am fully satisfied the Hunley can be used successfully in blowing up one or more of the ironclads in your harbor. So Beauregard, he's going to ask the Hunley to come to Charleston to help relieve the Union blockade. Now, the war began in Charleston, as we know. Union blockade by now is firmly in place, and the morale of the city is really very, very low. They're being strangled now. And Beauregard, he writes to Mobile on August 5th of 1863, have seen Watson and Whitney, and those are two of Hunley's investors, have accepted their submarine boat. Please assist them to get here as soon as possible. Now, if you remember, the Hunley can only do like 4 knots top speed. She is not made to travel in heavy waters, so she cannot travel there by sea. So what they're going to do is they're going to put the Hunley on 2 flatbed railroad cars, cover her with tarpaulins to kind of keep it a secret, and they're going to take her to Charleston over 627 miles away. And I think we're going to see her going any minute now. Should. Yeah, there she goes. So the Hunley is now on her way to Charleston. And that is going to be August 12th of 1863. She's going to arrive. Lieutenant Dixon and the engineer William Alexander, to their disappointment, they do not go forward with them. They are left behind. They are still with the 21st Alabama. Now let's take a look at a map here. This is a map of the Charleston Harbor Defensive in about 1863. And you can see Charleston in the circle there. And there's Fort Sumter to kind of get an orientation of what you're looking at. And over in Fort Johnson, right there, that's going to be the Hunley's first base. And that's where she's brought in. At this time, James McClintock, the designer, he's with the Hunley and a crew. And he's going to be running tests in Charleston Harbor. Now, keep in mind, this is still privately owned submarine. It was not under the jurisdiction of the Confederacy. It was still privately owned. And if they were going to sink any ships, they would get paid nicely. They would make a lot of money from privateer funds. So McClintock's here. Beauregard's happy to have him here. And Beauregard, when he first saw the Hunley, he had his doubts. It was not what he expected. He didn't think, he was like maybe a little disappointed, but he was optimistic that McClintock and the Hunley could help break that blockade. Now, McClintock is now running a lot of trials in the harbor. And he's doing a lot of test runs. But he's not attacking anything. Nothing's really happening. And Beauregard's getting very impatient. And he's going to take charge. He's going to take command of the Hunley and put it under the control of Confederacy. He's going to have the Army take over it. And he's going to put a military crew on it. The problem with that is this crew is not familiar with the submarine and the workings of it. And they're going to have their first major mishap. So you can see in that illustration where the Hunley is sitting at the pier there. See right here. They were climbing into the sub to go on a mission, the military crew. And those hatches were open. And the way the story goes is one of two things that happened. A passing ship with its large wake rocked the sub. Water filled into the hatches. And the submarine goes right to the bottom. 3 men get out. Lieutenant Charles Hasker, he was the last to leave the sub alive, and he's going to explain it like this. The manhole plate came down on my back, but I worked my way out until my left leg was caught in the plate. Pressing the calf of my leg in two, held in this manner, I was carried to the bottom. I felt the pressure relax. Stooping down, I took hold of the manhole plate, drew out my wounded limb, and swam to the surface. He would be the last to make it out of there. There are 5 still in that submarine, and they would drown and they would be killed. But the Confederacy does not give up hope, and within 72 hours of the fatal accident, General Beauregard sent the following order. Fish boat, still at bottom of bay, no one working on it. Adopt immediate measures to have it raised at once. And so they do. As you can see here in this illustration, they're going to raise the Hunley and bring it up. But their problems are only just beginning here. You see, there are still 5 bodies in that submarine. And those hatches are only 17.5 inches wide. And by now, the bodies have become swollen and bloated, and they won't fit. They can't get them out. So how are they going to get those bodies out of that submarine? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to send someone into that sub with a saw, and they're going to saw off the limbs and pass out the body parts one by one to get the men out of that sub. This is that crew. And you can see the 3 that did survive and the 5 that did not make it. A little bit of side note, this first crew, they're going to be buried in the old naval cemetery. And their location was lost for 135 years. And after checking some maps, they realized this naval cemetery was partially underneath the football citadel there in Charleston. And they actually broke concrete ground, and they actually found those men. And they knew they had the right ones because when they opened up the caskets, you can clearly see that their skeletal remains, the arms and legs, that they were sawed off. So they knew they had the right. So they would find them, and they would rebury them in Magnolia Cemetery with full military honors. Dixon has now arrived from Mobile, and he's placed in command. And they're going to get a new crew. And they had no problems getting volunteers, surprisingly, to volunteer to put together another crew, and they did. Horace Hunley himself is now in Charleston. But now there's another mishap. For some unknown reason they don't know, Dixon was away. He was the captain who's going to command the sub. And Horace Hunley himself, who really didn't know the workings of the sub that well, takes command. And they're running some test runs in the harbor. People from the shore can actually see the Hunley run their test runs. And it would be quite a spectacle drawing the crowds. And they would do these test dives on their training vessel called the Indian Chief. And the men on the Indian Chief got used to seeing the Hunley come up to them, dive under, and come up on the other side and move off. And these were just test runs. And one of these test runs, Horace Hunley was at the command. They dive under. And the men on the Indian Chief, they run to the other side, look to wait for the Hunley to come up, and there's no Hunley. And you know, sometimes it takes a little while, and then they waited again, and still no Hunley. And then they realized, yep, another incident with the Hunley. They lost another crew. This is how the divers found the Hunley. You can see the stern was raised up. The rear ballast tank was pumped out dry of water. The front was not, and water had filled up. And it was pilot error. Evidently, the seacock that you would open up to let water into the ballast tanks then it would have to be reclosed. And for whatever reason, Horace Hunley could not get it reclosed. He might have lost a wrench on the bottom of the sub and could not find it to close it down. And they could not pump out the front ballast tank. And because of that, they all died, all 8 of them. It was a grisly find when they opened up those hatches. They weren't locked because the men had tried to open them. You saw Horace Hunley's head in that front conning tower hatch with a candle in his hand, as if he was trying to open it. And this is that crew. You can see the name in red, Thomas Park. That was the son of one of the owners of the building where the Hunley was built. Because this was, again, an all-volunteer crew. Horace Hunley would get honorary captain, and he would be buried with this crew in Magnolia Cemetery. By now, General Beauregard has had it. He's declared the submarine a complete failure, and he's not going to risk any more men. He's done with it. But within days, Dixon, who was away, he writes to Beauregard when he heard of the incident, and he asked permission to raise another crew. Dixon was a brave, determined young man, and he wanted to try again. Beauregard would say this: the fish boat had sunk twice with the loss of 13 men, and none of them Yankees. I can have nothing more to do with that submarine boat. It's more dangerous to those who use it than to the enemy. Dixon's commander back in Alabama said, hey, give up this folly. Come back to Alabama. But Dixon's going to say this: you stated my presence was very much needed back in Mobile. I have no doubt it is, but for the present, I am fastened to Charleston and its approaches until I am able to blow up some of their Yankee ships. Finally, Beauregard agrees to try one more time, but he's going to give 2 stipulations. One, he wants it to be used not totally submerged, was one of them. But the other one was, he said, listen, it's got to be an all-volunteer crew. And before you can get that crew to volunteer, you need to tell them what happened to the first 2 crews before you let them volunteer. And surprisingly, they don't have any trouble getting volunteers. And some of the volunteers they get were from the training vessel, the Indian Chief. Let's go back to our Charleston map. And I want to show the positions of where the Hunley is placed in her bases. This is Fort Johnson. That's where she first was set up. She's going to get moved to Mount Pleasant. That's where the drawing on that first slide where the painting was probably made. But they needed to get farther out towards sea because the Hunley is very limited in how far she can go and travel with her limitations of propulsion. And the blockade is too far out. So they need to move her again. So they're going to move her again out to Sullivan's Island and Breach Inlet. And that arrow is pointing, you can't see Breach Inlet on this map, but it's just off to where that arrow is pointing. And that's going to get her closer to the blockade because she is limited on her range. Now, also keep in mind, at this time, the Hunley really was in a secret. There were some deserters that had gone and been captured by the Union and gave them a full description or a lot of information about this fish boat submarine. So they were aware of it. And Admiral Dahlgren, who was in charge of the Union fleet at the time of the blockade, would order the ships to always stay under power, even at night, so they can move quickly. He would order them to drop chains over the side of their ships at night, so hopefully submarine would not be able to pass under them. So he was taking a lot of precautions to be careful of this new secret weapon that the South had. By now, Dixon is training a new crew, and they're doing 3 to 4 sorties per week. He's working them really hard, this new crew. He wants to make no mistakes. The first 2 sinkings were pilot error, and he's going to work them hard, and they're going to make sure they know this sub inside and out, the workings of it, and are ready to go. William Alexander would say this: considering that every trip offshore with the Hunley was a risk, William Alexander said, after going out 6 or 7 miles, we would have to return. Many times it taxed our utmost exertion to keep from drifting out to sea. Daylight often breaking while we were yet in range, meaning in range of the enemy. So basically he's saying there, it took all they could muster to get back to their home base once they did these little sortie trial runs. Problem was, Hunley would struggle going against the ebb tide. Now here's another change that would happen. Towing a torpedo could have its problems. If you remember, that's how she's going to sink ships. But they're going to make a change of that. One of their trials, they're towing the torpedo. The ropes get tangled up, and the torpedo started going faster than they were, and they almost blew themselves up. So they're going to change their mode of attack, and they're going to put a 16-foot spar, as you see this illustration on the sub, with a 135-pound contact Singer torpedo. And this spar would be adjustable, so it could be raised or lowered to make a better impact of the attack. I think I have a, so if you look at this illustration here, you can see where it's at an angle, the spar is lowered and the torpedo to the end, and that's so as they're getting close to the enemy ship, they can get the torpedo underneath the bow of the ship for a better impact. They noticed from past experience from the David that attacked the new Ironsides, which rammed it on the side, a lot of the explosion would go straight up. So they knew if they can get the torpedo under the enemy ship, it would have a greater impact. So they were able to adjust the spar height. Now, here's something they didn't know for a long time. So they thought for a long while the spar had a barb on it, and that they would ram it into the enemy ship and then back off the sub, pull a lanyard to ignite the torpedo. But only recently, after finding the Hunley, they found that wasn't really what happened. They see the circle shown around the spar. There's a little blow up of it. You can see that's what they thought how they would attack a ship. That's not what they did. So what you're looking at now is the actual end of the 16-foot spar that was found when they found the Hunley and excavated it. So if you see within the circle, that's the copper fitting that actually held the torpedo. And you can see it's bolted. It's still bolted to the spar, and you can see how it's blown away from the explosion. So they never meant for that spar to slide off. It was just going to get rammed into the enemy vessel and explode. So that's how they did it. Again, to show the illustration here. So they're not going to pass under the enemy ship. They're going to just ram that torpedo underneath it and that's their plan to now sink ships. The other problem was there were shallow waters in Charleston Harbor, and it would have been very difficult to even try to pass underneath some of those blockaded ships. So what's going to be their target? Well, they waited months. The weather was terrible through that winter of late 63 and into 64. And the weather was never good for them. The weather had to be in their favor. Hunley could not handle rough waters. And finally, off of a breach inlet, there was their target, and it was the USS Housatonic, a 207-foot ship of war with a crew of 155. She was only 4 miles away, and that was the closest ship that she could get to, and that would become their target. Originally, the Hunley was hoping to be able to attack the Wabash, but again, the Housatonic was going to end up being their target. So this would be the plan. Breach inlet. Here's the Housatonic. There's the rest of the blockading fleet would be around there. And the plan would be to go straight for the Housatonic, hit her with the torpedo, and head directly back to Breach Inlet. Simple as that. That was the plan. This is a famous painting here by Mort Kunstler showing the Hunley on the night she's going to leave. And this was February 17th, 1864. And it was a little after 6 p.m. where they started loading up the sub. And they had to wait for the ebb tide. The sea was calm finally, and they finally had their chance to make this attack. Dixon was waiting a long time for the weather to be right. So was Beauregard. And finally, on this night, the conditions were right for them to make that attack. And this is that crew. William Alexander, the engineer, he was second in command. His leave of absence at Alabama ran out, and he was ordered back to Alabama with the 21st Alabama. And because of that, William Alexander is not on this final crew. So there's the Hunley heading out to sea for the Housatonic. And what they would do is they would ride semi-surface like that. And Dixon, they would open the hatch every once in a while to let in fresh air. And it was a grueling task. These guys, it was cold, sweaty, bad air. It was hard to make this sub move. And it was a rough task for these guys. And it took every bit of exertion of their part to really get those 4 miles out towards the Housatonic as they made their way. And it would take over a couple of hours to get there, those 4 miles. They would get spotted. Robert Fleming up in one of the masts would spot it first. And he said, see something out there. And a couple of the other guys said, that's a log that's floating around. And he said, no, I don't think it is. And they realized this log seemed to have a mind of its own and was coming right for them. So they tried shooting small fire arm down on it to stop it, but to no avail. The Hunley's going to hit the Housatonic on the starboard side near the stern in a very vulnerable spot, blasting a huge hole in her. Some of the crew would mention how they saw pieces of furniture floating out of the Housatonic. The hole was so big. The Housatonic is going to go down in just minutes. But fortunately, the water is only about 26 feet deep there. And so her rigging and mast stayed above the water, And a lot of these men were able to climb up on the riggings. A lot of them ended up in the water, but a lot of the Union blockade ships would come over to their rescue. So of the 155 men on the Housatonic, only 5 died. But the Hunley made history. And on that night, at the same moment that she made history, a mystery is born. Because after that, the Hunley was never seen or heard of again. You can see that lantern on the right here. That is a replica of the lantern that Dixon had on the sub. Dixon left orders when they left on their mission to the home base that if he was successful, he would hold up and shine 2 blue lights. And that would be the signal for them to light fires back at the shore so they could find their way back. Now, Robert Fleming, the Union naval man who was up in the rigging, claims he saw a blue light that night. And there were Confederates back at the base. One of them said he thought he saw a blue light too, and they lit the fires back. If you believe the blue light was seen, if that was true, that means the Hunley survived the attack, at least up to that moment. So what happened to the Hunley? Well, here are some popular theories of what may have happened to the Hunley and why she was lost. The lucky shot, the front conning tower, which I will show you later, was blown out. And they know it was early on the Hunley because they found pieces of metal in the bottom of the sub. If those pieces of metal from the conning tower were up high on the sub in the silt, that would have meant it happened years later. So they know it happened early, maybe even the night of the attack. Explosion from their own torpedo. There's always a theory. They're only 16 feet away from that torpedo, and the explosion might have shocked them and knocked them out, and they might have been killed from their own torpedo. The other theory was they could have been run over by one of the Union ships coming to the rescue. There are many of them coming to the scene, and the buoyancy of the Hunley was very precarious. It wouldn't take much for her to sink. There was a broken intake pipe on the Hunley in the front ballast tank. And if that broke intake pipe happened because of the explosion on that night, she would have sank in about 3 minutes. It wouldn't take much for her to lose buoyancy. So that was another theory. But they don't know when that pipe broke. It could have been years later when the sub was resting and rusting on the bottom of the harbor. Trapped by the tides. Now remember, the Hunley had trouble with propulsion, and she really had trouble going against the tides, and most likely she went out on her attack with the tide and would have had to wait a couple of hours, most likely for the tide to be in her favor to make it back. So it's very possible while waiting for the tide to be in her favor, she could have gotten stuck on the bottom of the harbor, or something had happened during that time, and that would have caused her demise. This camera shot is taken from Fort Sumter. And from there, the area, she's about 6 miles out from Fort Sumter in the view. Well, a lot of people tried to find the Hunley, but only one did. And that would be the famous author, a fiction writer, Clive Klutzer. He would fund a team called Numa. And on May 3rd, 1995, in about 26 feet of water, they would find the Hunley. And it would take 15 years of search before they found her. And what they would do is, you would see in the illustration, there would be a boat with a magnetometer floating back and forth across the harbor and looking for metal hits. And whenever they found a metal hit, they would send a diver down to check and see if that could be the Hunley. And that's how they did their search. And it took 15 years. they found the Hunley about 1,000 feet beyond the Housatonic, about 3 football fields. Clive Cluster, as we know, he recently died early last year, and I thought it would be appropriate to mention that. So if you look at this illustration here, you have the Hunley's home base. Housatonic and Hunley. So they never found the Hunley for about 136 years because they expected Hunley to be somewhere in between here where her mission was. But she was actually outside seaward of the Housatonic, and that's why she wasn't found for such a long time. So after 136 years, they're going to find the Hunley. You see the forward hatch. Here's an opening hole right here. That was early in her demise. The air box, snorkel air box, and this is the rear aft hatch. These were the first visuals that the divers found when they found the Hunley. So, how are they going to bring the Hunley up? Well, they would wait 5 years before they did it. And it was quite an achievement what they did. They took their time to get this right because everything on the Hunley on that night is in there. It's like a time capsule. And they couldn't just yank it up and find out the old metal iron was all going to break apart and all the contents were going to spill out all over the ocean. So they had to be very careful of what they did. And it took 5 years of planning before they did that. And it's going to be on August 8th of 2000. Hunley's going to see daylight for the first time in 136 years. Even her spar that held the torpedo was still attached. And this is how they're going to do it. They're going to build 2 anchor ends on either end here. And they're going to build a crane over the top. And they're going to run these straps underneath the sub. And they're going to be with foam. This is foam that's filled foam that would keep the Hunley in place. They're going to run those straps under the total bottom of the sub. And then as one whole piece, they're just going to pull it right out of the water. And here you see her out of the water for the first time in 136 years. Pretty amazing. They were amazed when they saw this. They couldn't believe that was a Civil War submarine. So the Hunley was completely filled and packed with harbor silt, which is a blessing in disguise because it preserved everything inside. So you can see here a couple of the outer plates were removed. They would remove a lot of these over time. And you can see they would have to scrape away, and it took years and years. They would scrape away this harbor silt, and they had to be very careful that they preserved and identified and marked all of these artifacts that they would find. Remember, there's 8 skeletal remains in there. Everything's there. This is a long shot looking from the captain's position of the sub before it was completely cleaned out. There's the wooden bench where they would sit when they turned the crank. Amazing, the wood was still there. There's the hand cranks where they would crank it. Way in the back, you can see the reduction gear for working the propeller. Way in the back there. Some of the artifacts that they found on the Hunley. There's the candle that Dixon held on the night of the attack. Dixon's watch. Dixon's binoculars. There's the lantern I was telling you about. that Dixon held that night. So here was a surprise nobody expected. Was there a Connecticut Yankee on the Hunley? Well, there was a mystery. On the Hunley, they found an ID tag. During the Civil War, they weren't issued out by the Army, but you could buy ID tags if you had $3, and some soldiers did. And I'm going to magnify this a little bit for you. This ID tag says Ezra Chamberlain, Company K, 7th Connecticut Volunteers, entered service September 6th, 1861. What is a private's ID tag from Connecticut doing on the South's most secret weapon? They were dumbfounded. Did Ezra Chamberlain, did he switch sides and volunteer to be on the sub? Was he captured and made to work the sub? They didn't know, but they did figure it out. Ezra Chamberlain was born October 20th, 1829. He's the oldest of 4 children. And you can see there he's from Killingly, Connecticut, upper east part of the state. I did a little research on my own to dig into it because friends of the Hunley weren't really sure what happened to him. But I did some digging in the Hartford archives, and that's his muster roster from the 7th Connecticut. And what I found out was this. Everybody's familiar with the assault on Battery Wagner, the 54th Massachusetts Black Regiment that made that attack on July 18th, 1863. Well, a lot of people forget on July 11th, the week before 1863, there was another first attack, and that involved the 6th and 7th Connecticut were involved in that attack. With the 7th Connecticut was Ezra Chamberlain. And from what I dug up in the archives was some of his buddies wrote that they saw Ezra Chamberlain get hit and go down as he was trying to rally some of his buddies around him. So we know Ezra Chamberlain was killed on July 11th at the first attack of Battery Wagner. So if we look at this, go back to our Charleston map. There's Hunley's first base, Fort Johnson. There's Battery Wagner where Ezra Chamberlain fought. One of the Hunley's crewmen, Joseph Ridgway, that's where they found the ID tag was with him. For a while, he was stationed at Battery Wagner. And it's very likely he had picked up that ID tag. Many times guys would do that, pick up trinkets and such. So he had picked up that ID tag on Battery Wagner. And ironically, he had it with him on the night he sank and died with the Hunley. So remember now, we're going to go back to that other mystery with Queenie Bennett and Lieutenant Dixon and the mystery of the gold coin or the lucky gold coin charm. So as they're entering the Hunley out, which took a long time, they're working from the stern or the back of the sub going forward, and they would take out these blocks of silt, a block at a time, and they would wash it and make sure they got all the artifacts, because you're talking about all skeleton remains, you're talking about textile, canteens, bottles. And they finally get to where the captain would be sitting, Lieutenant Dixon. Now in here you see, this is Maria Jacobson. She was the lead archaeologist at that time. And before they would pull out blocks of silt, they would reach in with their hand to make sure any plates that they're going to put in to pull out the silt wouldn't destroy any artifacts. So she's reaching in there with her hand. And as everyone knows, the edge of a coin is very distinct. That rough edging, you can't miss that. She's reaching in there and she feels it and she pulls her hand out and she goes, "I've got it." And you can see in her hand is the $20 1860 gold coin. Unbelievable. I'm going to magnify that for everyone. Let's take a look at that. And there's the 1860 gold coin that was with Dixon. Now, if you look within that circle, right there in Miss Liberty's bonnet, that's where the bullet hit that saved Dixon's life. So the legend was true. That really was Dixon's lucky gold coin. But here's one more thing that nobody knew when they got this coin. And this was a story that was not passed down through the years, and no one knew this. And this is going to be what's on the other side of that coin. And I'm going to flip this coin over so we can get a look at it. And there you see Shiloh, April 6th, 1862, my life preserver, George Dixon. He had it engraved. So if there was any doubt whether that was considered his gold luck coin, well, there's the proof right there. And that gold luck coin, I believe it's kept in like a 3-lock safe somewhere down in Charleston, and it's highly insured. So that was another mystery that was solved. Facial reconstruction, well, remember they had all the skeletal remains, so they're able to do all the facial reconstruction. And this is how they think the crew looked. On the upper left, that would be Lieutenant George Dixon. And on the bottom right, that is Joseph Ridgway. And it was with him where they found Ezra Chamberlain's ID tag. And there's the Hunley and her conservation tank at the Royal Ash Conservation Center. She would be filled, the tank would be filled with a solution until they would work on her, so she would not deteriorate. And then they would drain the tank, work on the sub to get it cleaned, empty out the artifacts, and then fill it back up with solution. Now this went on for like 17 years. And you can see her there, and you can see that like crustacean that they called it. It was like harder than concrete. It was really very difficult to get that off. But finally, up to just a few years ago, they actually now got all of it off, and the outside's been totally clean. So we're going to morph this over. So now you're going to see probably what the Hunley looked like on the night she made her attack. There you go. Pretty amazing. Her rudder is not attached. That did come off, but you can see the propeller. And these hatchways, these were opened up plates so they could work on the sub. Pretty amazing condition that she was in after all those years in Boston, in the Charleston Harbor. So now it's finally time to bury that crew. I was down there for the funeral, and that was such a long time ago now, April 16th, 2004. And they actually had a ceremony all week long up to that day in all the churches. And this was the last one. And we're going to take you inside that church. Here we go. And you can see them all laying in state in the full honor guard. Now it's finally going to be time to bury that third and final crew. And that would be on April 17th, 2004. There were over 60,000 spectators and 12,000 living historians were there to attend it. It was an amazing event at that time. And you can see them being carried on the caissons into the cemetery. You know, it's a big event when they get the kids involved. There were plenty of women wearing black that day. Got to remember, these are Civil War soldiers that are being buried for the very first time. And after 140 years, the third and final crew are laid to rest alongside the first two. And they are laid in order of how they were on the sub, right here. in the first two crews. Horace Hunley marker is here. So a little bit of postscript to wrap this up. So Ezra Chamberlain's body was never found at Barry Wagner. In fact, most of that is all underwater now. But his family never forgot him. I found his marker in Westfield Cemetery up in Killingley, Connecticut. And that's his marker there. Ezra Chamberlain obviously was not a spy, or he didn't change sides. He fought honorably and died heroically for his country. Lieutenant George Dixon, history will record that he will forever be known as the very first captain of the very first submarine to sink a ship in combat. He gave everything he had for that adventure. And finally, 140 years later, he's buried with his crew in Magnolia Cemetery. Queenie Bennett. So Queenie Bennett, eventually she's going to move on with her life. She marries a longtime friend in 1871. She moves to Mississippi, but she dies 12 years later in childbirth in 1883. Horace Hunley. Horace Hunley gave everything he had for this venture. He gave up, he was practically broke at the end. He gave up all his money. He put everything he had into this for a little bit of glory, fame. He'll forever known to be namesake of the Hunley. He was buried with full military honors in Magnolia Cemetery. James McClintock, who designed the Hunley, he would be known by some as the father of the modern submarine. And you can tell from some of the designs that the Hunley looks familiar in some ways. He's going to finish out the war in Mobile, Alabama, and he's going to continue to work on mines down there. He's going to survive the war. But in 1879, he's up in Boston Harbor working on a new contact mine, and he blows himself up. William Alexander, if you remember, he was called away at the very last moment on that last crew. So he's going to survive. He survives the war. He finishes up it down in Mobile, and doesn't talk much about Hunley over the years, but then later in life, as an older man, he starts to talk about it, and he gives some interviews. And fortunately for us, he also wrote about it. And because of that, a lot of the good information we have today is from what William Alexander wrote. Some of the details about how the sub worked and what they went through to make it go. A little bit of irony, I think, you can see there's a shot of the Hunley in her conservation tank, sitting in a solution. She's waiting for her, she will have a museum of her own. I guess it's still a few years away, but eventually she will. And I think in a way of irony there, she's kind of out-survived them all. And there's a Hunley sitting in amazing condition in her conservation tank. Now, William Alexander, in an interview in a newspaper years later, during an interview, he would have some interesting words he would say. And I think it's just a really appropriate way to end this presentation. And I want to use the words of William Alexander. And he would say this about the Hunley. And there's William Alexander. They were the first, so far as history records in all the world, to demonstrate the possibility of successfully operating a submarine torpedo boat. The Hunley accomplished the purpose for which a submarine torpedo boat was designed: to operate underwater, at sea, exploding a torpedo under and sinking the war vessel of an enemy in time of war. Submarine navigation arrived with the Hunley, William Alexander, 1903. These are sources, and I want to thank everybody for letting me tell this amazing story. I'm going to see if I can stop sharing there. Okay, can everybody still hear me and not share? All right.
Well,
So,
let me first to say,
Good job.
thank you, guys. You know, as the moderator, probably going forward, there was the moderator bar across. Hopefully you guys didn't see that, but I couldn't get rid of it. So I had to keep moving it so I could read the slides. That was why some of the delay. I hope that didn't interfere with what you guys saw.
No, we
No,
didn't
no.
see it. We didn't see it.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Because it was across me. It was the, well, it's the bar that's down here now. So it kept moving across the screen. It was blocking out some of the words. So I had to keep sliding it around. So if you saw a little delay here and there, that was it. I apologize for that. But everything else I think worked out all right. So, it's always a lot of fun telling that story. So I'm open to any questions.
I have one. Can you hear me?
Yes, Stuart. Yes, I can.
Yep. You're probably familiar with a recent book by Rachel Lance, who's the explosives expert. And I think she follows the theory that it was the blast that killed the Hunley. What do you think of her data?
Yes, I don't have her book. I know of her. I read the articles. She was from Purdue University, and I know they built some model and they put it in a pond and they did some tests. So there is some possibility that could have been what happened. Friends of the Hunley, they're using Clemson University for their additional research. I do know the Navy originally, they went to the Navy and they had the Navy run some tests on whether that would possibly be the case. And the Navy at the time said no, that it would not. But it's still a possibility because there's a lot of unanswered questions here. One of the things they're not sure of, there's some records, and a lot of records of the Confederacy are missing, but there are some records whether they used a 120-pound torpedo or a 135-pound torpedo. I used 135-pound in my notes in the presentation, and that would affect it. But here's the thing. If it knocked them out and it killed them that night, then you don't believe that, Dixon held up, I stole their lantern. He held up the lantern with the blue light. Then you don't believe that. If they saw the blue light, then that means they survived the attack and they weren't not killed by the explosion. Now, there's another thing to think about. Remember, if they died then, the Hunley was found 1,000 feet beyond the Housatonic, which is like 3 football fields. So they had to get there somehow. And if she was destroyed, her buoyancy was very precarious. If the explosion did her in, she would have sank there. She would not have made it that far out, I believe. So there's a lot of theories, and you have to read them all. There's no real smoking gun yet. Friends of the Hunley, it is a possibility that's what happened, but they're not saying, yeah, that is definitively yet, because they're really just not sure, because there's other issues there that I had mentioned, some of those other possibilities, one being trapped by the tides. They don't think she was hit by an oncoming ship because they couldn't find any damage on her outer hull at all. In fact, they're pretty sure the outer hull was pretty intact for a while before it was breached by rust.
Yeah, I remember one of Rachel's points, one of the things she uses in her favor was that the crew were all found at their places. where they had served, and it didn't seem like there was a mad dash for the exit or anybody trying to trying to get that last gasp of air before it filled up. So she thinks that they died very quickly, apparently. Whether you can really tell that from the positions of the bodies or not, it's hard to say. But that's I guess one clue in deciding what might have happened.
You're right, Stuart. That is a clue. They were all found in place in their positions. Didn't seem to be a mad dash to escape the ship. And interesting, William Alexander talked about him and Dixon talked about if they got stuck, what they would do. And they swore that they would never sit there and die of suffocation, that horrible death. If they got trapped, they agreed that they would flood the sub and go down that way. Just saying. And interestingly, the back hatch was still locked when they found the sub. The front one was open, which would make sense because as Dixon was getting close, he would open the hatch to let in fresh air as they would get close in their attack. But that did not necessarily mean the sub would flood with it closed. They said even with it closed, it would not let in water. So, and then the interesting thing they discovered, I mentioned about the intake pipe. So there's an intake pipe that would let water into that forward ballast tank and also expel it. It was broken off. If it broke off because of the explosion, it would only take 3 minutes for the sub to go down and sink. They tested that. But they don't think that, but if that happened, it would take 20 minutes for the sub to end up where she was beyond the Hunley. So if it broke early, they don't believe that would have happened. She would have, because 3 minutes, she would have went down. It would have taken at least 20 minutes, even if the tide was going to drift her out based on their calculations.
Phil,
Yes.
so I have a question. Isn't there damage to the conning tower? Didn't they find damage to the front conning tower and the glass?
Yep. And if you remember, I guess you remember that those early pictures I showed you where you saw the damage. I can pull it up on the screen, but that's okay. I guess everybody saw it. But so yes, they know it happened early in her demise, maybe even the night of the attack, because pieces of metal that would have been around the glass plate. Now, out of 18 glass portholes, that was the only one missing. All the rest were in place. Pretty amazing. So the framework around that, was broken. Now they found pieces of metal in the bottom of the sub. Now remember, the sub was filled with silt. So if it happened years later, you would think those pieces of metal would have been higher up in the silt, but because they were on the bottom of the sub, they know it happened very, very early in her demise, possibly even the night of the attack. And there's where the lucky shot theory comes in. If a bullet maybe hit that, because it's a cast iron and it could crack. If it cracked and broke it. Now, and the theory was maybe Dixon got hit in the head and he was killed. A lucky shot. But they found no bullet inside the sub. I mean, they found everything. They even found matchsticks. So they found no bullet inside the sub. But if it did break early on, here's the other thing then, and the ship floods, she's going to go down in a couple of minutes. And yet she still ends up 1,000 feet beyond the Hunley. So again, there are speculations that could be it, but then there's other counter speculations that maybe it couldn't have. Maybe when she sank, an anchor from a ship all those years could have hit it, maybe could have broken it before it was too long in, maybe something like that. Who knows? But you're right. That is one of the theories that they originally looked at. In fact, that was the first strong theory they were looking at originally. But again, they haven't come out and said, Friends of the Hunley has not come out and said, hey, we know this is exactly what happened. Not yet anyways.
Is there any, you keep saying that the Hunley ended up 1,000 feet past the Housatonic, correct?
Correct.
So out towards the sea, not in towards the land?
Yes, correct. And that's what kept her hidden for so long. She was buried almost totally up to the, well, here's an interesting thing. So I'll add this little tidbit. And so Clive Cluster, who I mentioned, he funded the whole thing to look for the Hunley. And if you remember that illustration where they showed the boat with the magnometers, that little illustration there, and if they found a metal object on the bottom of the harbor, then they would send divers down because the harbor's not that deep. Some places it's 40 feet, some 26 feet, and they would check. And they said, no, yes, no, no, not there. And they would mark all the sites. I mean, they knew them all and they marked them all. And after about 15 years, they still hadn't found the Hunley. I mean, they found a lot of blockade runners that were unknown. They've located a lot of wreckage and stuff. So now they're rechecking everything. They're going through it again. What did we miss? How come we can't find it? I mean, they're checking and said, you know what, let's revisit our first 10 locations that we X'd off that there's no Hunley. They go to location number 1. They go back down there, and that was the Hunley. Because at the time these guys went down there, it was all covered up with a lot of muck, and I think there's rocks and stuff. And over the 15 years since they checked it, the current had uncovered some of the Hunley. So site number 1, they actually found it and didn't know.
Oh, wow.
P.T. Barnum actually tried to find the Hunley. He put up a $80,000 reward, no, $100,000 reward back in, I don't know, the 1880s or something like that.
So I guess a follow-up question to that would be, do you remember the midget submarines that attacked Pearl Harbor?
Sure.
And one of the midget submarines that attacked Pearl Harbor was nowhere near where it should have went down.
That's right.
Theory with that is that it spun down, and that's why it ended up, it was, I can't remember, I think a mile away from where it actually should have been. Is that something the Hunley could have done as it spun down?
Well, I don't think so, because I don't think the harbor was deep enough. I mean, where those midget subs were, the water was deep enough, so it had time as it's spinning and moving to move. Only she found it was only 26 feet of water, so there's not enough depth distance for her to spun down. But you bring up a point. Let's say the explosion knocked them out and the hull wasn't breached. Could she have just drifted slowly off 1,000 feet and then drifted down and just settled there? Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. But I don't think she would have spun down because just the depth of the water is just not great enough.
It's not deep enough to do it.
Yeah, just not deep enough to do that. Now, Robert Fleming, he was in the inquiry. He was actually, I think he was a black sailor. He was the one who said, he was the one who actually first saw the Hunley and probably the last one to ever see it. And he's the one that swore to his dying day about the blue light. And those records are found in the inquiry. So he swore he saw the blue light. If you believe that, then that means she did survive the initial attack. What happened after that? Again, the tides would have been a problem. As you saw from William Alexander's comments, they struggled at times on their test runs just to get back, to make it against the tide. It was a struggle.
Well, I'll give you like one more quick question. Now, whenever I go to Cape Cod, people tell me what I have to do is go watch the submarine races. Unfortunately, I've never been able to take them up on that offer, but you're probably familiar with the Union submarine, the Alligator?
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought I bring that up. Yes.
Yeah. If in some way we could recreate both of them in perfect shape as they were intended to be built, which one do you think would be the more effective submarine?
Well, from what I know from the Alligator, originally, if you can believe this, remember propulsion? She was fitted out with oars. Yeah, oars.
Oars.
As in rowing oars and the submarine underwater. Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously that didn't work, and they did put a screw on her. And they were towing her south. And during the storm, they were going to lose their ship, so they had to cut her loose, and they've never found her. Now, she was not going to be used to sink ships because the Confederacy didn't really have a navy. She was actually going to be used to demine the harbor. Actually, that's what the Alligator was going to be used for. Yeah, which one would be the better? I don't know. I know Simon Lake, who a lot of people call the father of this modern submarine, but McClintock was years before him. He had spoken to Haster. He was the last guy who swam out of the Hunley when on that first crew. And he took a lot of notes from Hasker when he was building his first subs. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really know how well the Alligator was really built, but
Yeah. So, well, if they ever find that one, they should do kind of a side-by-side comparison.
Yeah. Another note, and I mentioned the first submarine was found by the Union Army. The engineers took dimensions of it and such, and of course she was torn up for scrap. Now the second one, the Pioneer 2, or the American Diver, which was lost off of the Mobile Bay, they haven't found that. So that would be interesting to find that, to compare the difference, the improvements the Hunley made over the second one, but they have not found that one. I don't know if anybody seriously looked for it, but they have never found that one.
Well, are there any other questions? I don't see any on the chat feature. Well, Phil, thank you. That was a incredibly fascinating presentation. Learned a lot. I had read about the Hunley before, but there's a whole lot that you mentioned that I certainly hadn't heard of. It's not just a good story, it's a whole collection of great stories. And of course, I want to say thank you to Pat for his technological expertise, and Mark for helping to set it up, and anybody else who is involved in the presentation. And of course, I want to thank everybody who attended and listened tonight. And we also hope to see you all again, because we'll be having another Buffs virtual meeting coming on May 26th at 7 o'clock. Buffs member and Civil War historian Diana McCarthy will present a hard battle, Peter and Clorinda Dumont Civil War letters, about her ancestors' experiences in 146th New York. That sounds like it's going to be a fascinating program. On the meeting following that, on July 28th, Michael Barrett has agreed to talk about the Civil War history of the famous Burden Iron Works. We are still looking for speakers for the upcoming Buffs meetings on September 22nd and November 17th. Remember, this is a great opportunity. If you have some research or a program that you're trying out and putting together, we'd glad to hear from you. Once again, everybody, thank you for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody at the next meeting.
Great presentation.
All right,
Thanks,
very good.
Phil.
Thanks for having me. Really, I had a great time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Phil. It was really good.
Yeah, thanks.
We're happy.
You're a veteran now, Phil. You even survived the test we had on Sunday.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Excellent.
On a transfer.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night,
Have a good one.
everybody. Good night. Take care.
Bye-bye.
No. It's like it's getting less and less. I'll be the last one because the captain always goes down with the ship there.
That's it.